The fountain pen felt heavier than a loaded pistol in his hand. Its gold nib hovered over the signature line, catching the amber light from the crystal chandelier overhead. That single drop of black ink swelling at the tip like a held breath, trembling, pregnant with the death of something he hadn't realized he'd been trying to save. The paper was thick and creamy and watermarked with an insignia that cost more to produce than most people made in a month, and everything in this room was like that. Impossibly expensive, meticulously chosen, designed to project power and permanence, designed to make you forget that none of it mattered when the person holding the pen decided to stop pretending. Everything except him. Julian Ashford stared at the document spread across the vast mahogany desk, and he felt the familiar numbness settle over him like a winter coat that didn't quite fit anymore. Petition for dissolution of bond. Such sterile words for dismantling 5 years of his life, for the cold, quiet transaction his marriage had become, for the careful architecture of a cage he'd built with his own hands because he believed, stupidly, desperately, that security and love were the same thing. He'd been 23 when he signed the first set of papers, young and terrified, and so hungry for someone to see him as more than a pretty omega with a good breeding line and a trust fund that had evaporated before he'd even presented. He'd been desperate, though he'd hidden it well, and Dante Rossini had looked at him with those dark, assessing eyes and seen exactly what he needed. A blank canvas. A compliant omega with no packed ties and no ambitions beyond the walls of whatever gilded cage he was placed in. Across that same mahogany desk now, Dante watched him, and his stillness was a predatory thing, the kind of patience that belonged to wolves and men who had never been told no. He wore a charcoal suit tailored with surgical precision to his broad shoulders, and his hands rested flat on the polished wood, fingers splayed like he was about to pounce, and Julian could smell him from here. Cedar and gunpowder and something darker, something that had always made his omega instinct sing even when his mind knew better. Dante was 41, 10 years older than Julian, and he moved through the world like it owed him space. Like every room he entered was merely waiting for permission to exist. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. His words, delivered in that low, even tone 20 minutes ago, were more effective than any shout. Liam is back, he'd said, his eyes never leaving Julian's face, watching for the cracks, for the tears, for the pathetic plea that he'd clearly been expecting. It's time. And now the pen, the paper, the choice that was not a choice at all. Julian's hand remained steady even as his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird, even as the familiar scent of Dante's alpha pheromones wrapped around him like a noose. He had trained himself for this. Years of presenting calm when chaos raged beneath his skin, years of suppressing every instinct that screamed at him to submit, to beg, to do anything to keep this alpha who had never really wanted him. It was the one thing he was truly good at, the one thing that had made him useful to a man like Dante Rossini. The ability to disappear into the background, to become a piece of furniture, to ask no questions and make no demands and never once look inside the locked study where the real business happened. Dante needed an omega who would ask no questions, he'd said once, early in their courtship, when Julian had been too young and too starved for affection to understand what that really meant. Someone who would blend into the background of his opulent, violent world. An omega without ties, without family that could be used as leverage, without the kind of ambition that might threaten the delicate balance of power he'd spent his life constructing. Julian had nodded and smiled and let himself be folded into that world, let himself be dressed in designer clothes and paraded at charity galas and tucked away in the penthouse like a particularly expensive painting. He had played that role perfectly. For 5 years, he had been a fixture in Dante's world, a piece of solid, reliable furniture, unremarkable, safe, a properly demure omega husband who hosted dinner parties with grace and never once asked where the money for his art collection actually came from. He'd learned the names of Dante's lieutenants, the shorthand they used for their deals, the way their eyes flickered when they talked about shipments and territories. He'd learned everything, quietly, carefully, filing it away in the orderly compartments of his mind like the financial ledgers he'd been allowed to manage because Dante assumed he was too timid to look beyond the surface. Now he pressed the nib to the paper, and the ink bled into the fibers, a dark stain spreading like a bruise across the pristine surface. Julian Alexander Ashford Rossini. His signature was neat and controlled, the loops and lines as precise as the seating charts he'd arranged for 100 corporate functions, as careful as the smile he'd worn through 5 years of dinner parties and whispered rumors, and the slow, creeping realization that he was never going to be loved the way he'd hoped. He slid the document across the desk, his part of the transaction complete, and he watched Dante pick it up with those elegant, lethal hands, his eyes scanning the signature with the quick efficiency of a man who had reviewed 1,000 contracts. A curt nod, almost imperceptible, was his only acknowledgement. It was done. Dante had expected tears, expected negotiation, perhaps a pathetic plea, the kind of desperate bargaining that Omegas were supposedly prone to when their alpha cast them aside. He had prepared himself for the emotional manipulation that he assumed was coded into Julian's very biology, for the tears and the begging and the desperate offers to change, to be better, to be anything at all, if only Dante would keep him. What he hadn't prepared for was silence. Julian's quiet seemed to unnerve him more than any outburst would have. Something flickered across Dante's face, annoyance, perhaps, or confusion, that strange emotion that crossed his features when something didn't go according to plan. He opened a drawer and produced another envelope, this one thicker, and the weight of it suggested paper rather than cash. Julian could guess what it contained. The settlement, the generous payout designed to make him disappear quietly, to ensure that he never embarrassed the Rossini name by going to the press or the police or any of the other institutions that might threaten the carefully constructed facade of legitimacy. "This is generous," Dante said, not as a question but as a fact, his voice low and even and utterly devoid of warmth. "A clean break. You'll want for nothing." Julian looked at the envelope but made no move to take it, and he felt the strange, wild thrill of defiance surge through him like a drug. "I already have everything I need, Dante." The words hung between them like a challenge, and for the first time, a crack appeared in Dante's composure. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes narrowed, and Julian could see him reassessing, recalculating, trying to understand what had just happened. He watched Julian rise from the leather chair, not gracefully, not with the fluid elegance that Omegas were supposed to possess, but with the steady, deliberate movement of someone who had finished a task and was moving on to the next. Julian's body was soft, curved in ways that suggested comfort rather than ornament, and he'd always been self-conscious about it, had spent years trying to mold himself into the sleek, model-thin Omega that alphas like Dante were supposed to want. But Liam was that kind of Omega, young and beautiful and effortlessly perfect, and Julian had never been able to compete, had never wanted to compete, had only wanted to be seen. Dante's eyes tracked him across the room, cataloging details he hadn't bothered to notice in years. The way Julian's hair, a shade of warm brown that caught gold in certain light, curled at the nape of his neck in a way that made Dante's fingers itch. The slope of his shoulders, the curve of his hip, the quiet dignity in the way he held himself even now. Even after being discarded like yesterday's newspaper. He had always seen those things as features rather than flaws, Dante realized with something that might have been surprise. A soft Omega was a manageable Omega, compliant and predictable and easy to control. He was beginning to question that assessment. Julian walked toward the door of the study, his movements unhurried, and he did not look back. The click of the lock disengaging was the only sound in the cavernous room. And then the heavy oak door swung shut behind him, and Dante was left alone with the signed papers and the unsettling feeling that he had just concluded a deal where he had not understood all the terms. He had dismissed Julian, had treated him like a piece of furniture to be replaced when a newer, shinier model came along. That was his first mistake. His second was assuming Julian would simply disappear. The penthouse felt empty that night, emptier than it had any right to feel, and Dante found himself wandering through rooms that had once been filled with Julian's quiet presence. The kitchen where Julian had brewed his chamomile tea every morning, the library where he'd curled up with his books, the bedroom where he'd slept on the far edge of the bed because Dante never reached for him in the night. The silence was deafening, and Dante poured himself a glass of whiskey and tried to remember why he'd thought this was a good idea. Liam was back, beautiful and demanding, and everything an alpha was supposed to want, but Liam had never made the penthouse feel like a home. Liam had never looked at Dante with those quiet, steady eyes and asked nothing, expected nothing, given everything. Dante shook off the thought, annoyed at his own sentimentality. Julian had been a transaction, a marriage of convenience, a means to an end. He had served his purpose, and now he was gone, and Dante had what he'd always wanted. The freedom to pursue the Omega he'd actually desired, the one who set his blood on fire instead of warming it slowly like a banked ember. Except that Liam had called twice in the past week, demanding attention, demanding commitment, demanding the kind of emotional investment that Dante had never been able to give anyone. And Julian had never demanded anything. Julian had simply been there, solid and reliable and quietly essential, like the foundation of a building that you only noticed when it started to crumble. In his new apartment in Brooklyn, Julian was arranging his books by color and height, finding the perfect spot for his grandmother's tea set, and feeling the strange, giddy lightness of freedom settle over him like a blessing. The apartment was small and filled with the scent of old paper and the kind of light that came through windows that had been washed by rain for decades, and it was worlds away from the cold glass and steel of the penthouse. It was his, and he had paid for it himself, with money he'd carefully siphoned away over 5 years of managing Dante's finances. Money that Dante would never miss because Julian had made sure the numbers always balanced perfectly. He'd bought a plant, a small fern that he named Gerald, and he'd talked to it while he brewed his morning tea, and he'd felt the suppressed Omega instincts that he'd kept locked away for years surge up desperate and hungry for safety, for nest, for the simple comfort of a space that was truly his own. It was ridiculous, and it was freeing, and Julian let himself cry for the first time in years. Not because he missed Dante, not because he was grieving the end of his marriage, but because he was finally allowed to feel something. He'd spent 5 years suppressing every emotion that might inconvenience Dante, every instinct that might make him seem like too much trouble, every desire that might threaten the careful equilibrium of his gilded cage. He'd been so good at being nothing that he'd almost forgotten he was something. Now he was remembering, slowly and painfully, and it hurt like a limb waking up after it had fallen asleep. But even as he arranged his new life, he was watching and waiting. 5 years of pretending to be nothing but a pretty Omega had taught him how to see without being seen, how to observe patterns and catalog information, how to build a map of an empire that had no idea it was being mapped. He knew Dante's moods, the subtle tensions in his shoulders that preceded a storm. He knew the names of his lieutenants, the shorthand they used for their deals, the way their eyes flickered when they talked about shipments and territories. He knew about the holding company in the Cayman Islands, the one that funneled funds for the European shipping logistics. And he knew about the clause that he'd drafted 5 years ago, when he'd been a newlywed Omega trying to prove he was useful enough to keep. A clause that tied the account's assets to his marital status, a clause that no one had known existed, a clause that would trigger the moment the divorce was finalized and freeze every dollar in that account. He'd been thorough, because that was what Dante valued in his work. He'd been careful, because that was what kept him safe. And he'd been patient, because that was what would ultimately set him free. The first tremor hit Dante's empire 2 weeks after the divorce papers were signed. It was subtle, almost undetectable, like the first crack in a dam that had been holding back a flood. The Cayman Islands account suddenly had its assets frozen, and the bank was citing an obscure spousal protection clause that required a signature from Julian Ashford Rossini to release the funds. Dante sat in his study with the phone hot against his ear, listening to Enzo's clipped, worried tone on the other end, and he felt the world tilt beneath him. He looked at the divorce papers still sitting on the corner of his desk, and he realized with cold, sinking certainty that Julian had been playing a longer game than he'd ever imagined. He'd given Julian a pen, and Julian had used it to write a declaration of war that Dante hadn't even seen coming. His clean break was a tangled mess, and he, Dante Rossini, the most feared alpha in New York, the man who had built an empire from nothing, the man who had never needed anyone, needed his quiet, discarded Omega to fix it. He had let Julian go, and now he had to get him back, and the humiliation of that realization burned in his chest like a brand. It took Dante's men 3 days to find the Brooklyn apartment, and Julian had known they would eventually. He'd only needed enough time to make his position unassailable, to ensure that when Dante came knocking, it would be on Julian's terms. Still, when the knock came on his door, not a polite rap, but a solid, authoritative sound that vibrated through the floor, he felt a flash of something that might have been fear or excitement or some strange combination of the two. He'd taken suppressants the night before, carefully calculated doses designed to keep his scent neutral and his instincts suppressed, and he dressed in a simple gray sweater that had cost $30 at a secondhand shop. He wouldn't be swayed by Dante's pheromones, and he wouldn't be intimidated by his presence. He would be calm and steady and utterly unshakable. He opened the door to find Dante standing there, flanked by 2 of his soldiers, and the sight of him made Julian's breath catch despite everything. Dante was dressed in a black overcoat, the collar turned up against a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, and his scent, cedar and gunpowder and something darkly alpha, filled the narrow hallway like a physical presence. He looked tired, Julian noticed with a small, sharp satisfaction. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, like the weight of his crumbling empire was pressing down on his shoulders, and Julian felt a surge of dark pleasure at the sight. "Julian," Dante said, and his voice was a low rumble, the kind that usually preceded a command. "Dante." Julian's tone was even, betraying nothing. "You shouldn't be here. We need to talk. I believe we said everything that needed to be said." Julian made no move to let him in. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, and he watched Dante's eyes flicker with something that might have been annoyance or confusion or the first stirrings of respect. The soldiers behind him shifted uneasily, clearly expecting this encounter to go differently, expecting the Omega to crumple or cry or do something that would justify the Alpha's presence. "You know why I'm here," Dante said, and there was an edge to his voice now, a thread of frustration that Julian filed away for future reference. "The Caspian Holdings account. It's frozen. You know why? It's a standard clause," Julian said smoothly. "To protect assets in the case of a dissolution. I assume your lawyers missed it." "My lawyers didn't set up the trust, Julian." "You did." The accusation was plain, and Julian felt a small, vicious thrill at the realization that Dante finally understood. For 5 years, he'd been dismissed as nothing more than a pretty face, a compliant Omega who would never challenge his alpha or threaten his empire. For 5 years, he'd been underestimated and overlooked and treated like furniture, and now Dante was standing in his doorway, desperate and humiliated and needing Julian to fix the mess he'd made. "I was always thorough," Julian said, and he let a small smile curve the corner of his mouth. "You valued that in my work. Unlock it." Dante's voice was sharp now, edged with the Alpha's authority, and Julian could feel the weight of his pheromones pressing against his defenses. But the suppressants held, and Julian's control held, and he met Dante's gaze without flinching. "The divorce isn't finalized yet," he said. "The settlement you offered is generous, but it doesn't reflect my contribution to the growth of your legitimate enterprises. One might call this a renegotiation." Dante took a step closer, and he was so tall, so broad, so utterly alpha that it took every ounce of Julian's willpower not to step back. He could smell Dante's anger now, sharp and metallic, mixed with something else, something that might have been fear. The man who had never feared anything was afraid of his Omega, and Julian savored that knowledge like a fine wine. "This is a dangerous game you're playing," Dante whispered, the words a silken threat. "It's your game, Dante. I just finally learned the rules." Julian paused, letting the silence stretch like a held breath, and then he delivered the killing blow. "You need my signature. If you want it, you'll come back tomorrow. Alone. And we'll discuss my new terms. Until then, I suggest you find a way to make your payroll without access to your offshore accounts." He closed the door in Dante's face, not a slam but a quiet, firm click that felt louder than any explosion. And then he leaned against the wood, his heart pounding, and let himself laugh. A breathless, giddy sound that was half terror and half triumph. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. He'd stood up to the most powerful alpha in New York and made him beg. Dante returned the next day, as Julian knew he would. He was alone this time, his Blacktown car a dark predator parked at the curb, and when Julian opened the door, he was holding a single file, the kind of thick, legal-sized folder that contained the weight of an empire. He stepped inside without being invited, his presence instantly shrinking the small apartment, and Julian felt his Omega instincts warring with his carefully constructed composure. The suppressants were still working, but Dante was so close, so alpha, and the instinct to submit was so deeply ingrained that it took every ounce of willpower to stay upright. "Your terms," Dante said, dropping the file on Julian's small dining table. It landed with a heavy thud, and Julian didn't open it. "My terms aren't financial, Dante." He watched Dante turn slowly, his eyes narrowing, and he felt a surge of satisfaction at the confusion that flickered across his face. "I want oversight. Full access to the legitimate holdings, not just the shipping company, all of them. The real estate ventures, the import-export businesses, everything. I'll restructure them, protect them, make them invulnerable to this kind of inconvenience." Dante stared at him, incredulous. "You want a job?" "I want control of the one thing I can control." Julian corrected him, his voice steady and sure. "The numbers. Your other world, the one with guns and whispers, that's yours. But the money, the foundation it's all built on, that will be mine to manage. I'll be your partner, not your husband. And certainly not your victim." It was an audacious demand, unthinkable to give an outsider, an ex-husband, a discarded Omega that kind of power. But the alternative was ruin, and Dante knew it. The Moretti family, his oldest rivals, were already circling like sharks smelling blood in the water, and a single moment of weakness would be the end of everything he'd built. Julian had him cornered, and they both knew it. "You do this," Dante said, his voice dangerously low, "and you're back in. All the way in. There's no leaving a second time." "I'm not planning on leaving." Julian met his gaze without flinching. "I'm planning on surviving." That was the moment everything changed. Dante agreed, because he had no choice, and something shifted between them in that small, crowded apartment. It was in the way Dante looked at him now, not with the dismissive condescension of a man who saw furniture, but with something like respect, something like wariness, something like desire. It was in the way Julian's suppressed Omega instincts surged at that look, desperate and hungry for the alpha's approval. But Julian had spent 5 years suppressing those instincts, and he could suppress them a little longer. The new arrangement began quietly. Julian worked from his small apartment, a ghost in Dante's machine, untangling the complex web of shell corporations and trusts that Dante had built over decades. He sent encrypted hard drives back and forth with Dante's driver, and they spoke only when necessary, their conversations brief and transactional. But something shifted between them, something neither of them acknowledged. It was in the way Dante started lingering at the door when he dropped off files, the way his eyes lingered on Julian's face, the way his scent, even through the suppressants, seemed to reach for Julian like a hand seeking warmth. It was in the way Julian's hand brushed against Dante's when he passed him a document, an electric shock that made them both pull back as if burned. 2 months into the arrangement, the Morettis made their move. They'd heard about the divorce, about the disruption in Dante's accounts, and they'd assumed it was weakness, an alpha distracted by the loss of his omega. They sent a message by firebombing Liam's car, a flashy Maserati that had been parked outside a designer boutique, and Liam was hysterical and demanding protection and attention. Julian heard about it through the grapevine. Enzo's wife, who had become something of a friend, called to warn him. "They think Liam is Dante's weakness," she said, her voice low with worry. "Is he?" Julian asked, and the silence on the other end was answer enough. Julian didn't let himself feel the sharp twist of something that might have been jealousy. He'd learned not to feel things like that, not to want things he couldn't have. Liam was beautiful and young, and everything an alpha was supposed to want, and Julian was just the quiet omega who'd been discarded and then grudgingly rehired. But he'd heard the way Dante talked about Liam, the impatience in his voice, the frustration, the sense that Liam was a distraction rather than a partner. Dante's weakness wasn't Liam. Dante's weakness was his own past, the wound that had never healed, the betrayal that had made it impossible for him to trust anyone. Julian had heard the story once, in the early days of their marriage, when Dante had been drunk and vulnerable and desperate for someone to confess to. His father had been killed because his most trusted capo, a man he loved like a brother, had sold him out to the Morettis for a piece of their territory. Since then, Dante trusted no one. He had married Julian precisely because he believed Julian had no ambition, no angle, no one to betray him for. He had built a fortress around his heart, and Julian had been part of the wall. The Morettis were looking for a crack in the foundation, testing Dante's defenses, and they'd chosen the wrong target. "They should have come for me," Julian murmured to himself that night, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. "Liam is the distraction. I'm the actual threat." He should have been afraid. Any sensible Omega would have been terrified at the thought of becoming a target in a Mafia war. But Julian had been terrified for 5 years, terrified every time Dante came home with blood under his nails, every time the doorbell rang at 3 a.m., every time a call came that made Dante's face go still and dangerous. Terror was old hat, a familiar companion that had followed him through every dinner party and every charity gala and every lonely night in that cold penthouse. This was something else entirely, something that felt dangerously like power. They came for him 3 days later, not with bombs or guns, but with quiet, professional precision. 2 men in dark suits intercepted him on his morning walk, their scents sharp with the chemical tang of suppressants and aggression, and Julian saw them coming and made a decision. He could run, could scream, could fight, but he was outnumbered and outweighed, and the neighborhood was empty at this hour. So he went limp in their grasp, making himself dead weight as they bundled him into the back of a black sedan, and he kicked off one of his shoes as they pushed him in. A sturdy brown loafer that skittered under a parked car, a small, insignificant detail that no one would notice. No one except Leo, the head of Dante's security, who was supposed to be watching Julian's building. Leo was meticulous, and he would notice a single shoe where there should be none. In the car, a thick burlap sack was pulled over his head, and the smell of stale cigar smoke and cheap air freshener filled his nostrils. Julian focused on the sounds, the turns, the rumble of tires over different road surfaces, the distant wail of a siren, the horn of a truck. His mind, trained by years of quiet observation, began building a map, cataloging the data, counting the seconds between turns. He would not be a helpless victim. He had never been one. When they finally pulled the sack from his head, Julian was in a damp concrete basement, the air cold and smelling of mildew. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the room, and a man sat on a wooden chair opposite him. He was older, with a face like a collapsed building, craggy and worn, with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw. Julian recognized him from news photos. Alessandro Moretti, the head of the rival family, the man who had been Dante's enemy for decades. "I'm just an accountant," Julian said, his voice steady despite the frantic pounding of his heart. "I don't know anything." Moretti smiled, a chilling sight that made Julian's blood run cold. No, you're a queen. You hold his treasury, and you're going to give it to me. That was when Julian made the mistake of looking past Moretti, into the shadows behind him, and he saw Enzo standing there, Dante's underboss, his second in command, the man Dante trusted with his life. And he was standing with the enemy. The betrayal was a cold physical shock, worse than the kidnapping, worse than the fear, worse than anything Julian had ever felt. Enzo had been there for 5 years, through Dante's rise, through his marriage, through every late-night negotiation and bloody reckoning. He was the closest thing Dante had to family, and he was a traitor. Julian's mind raced, cataloging the implications. Enzo had access to everything. Dante's schedules, his security protocols, his financial records. He could have been feeding information to the Morettis for years. He could have been the one who told them about the frozen accounts, about the divorce, about the crack in Dante's carefully constructed armor. But there was something else, something that made Julian's blood run even colder. Enzo was an alpha, strong and ruthless and ambitious, and he had spent 5 years watching Dante's soft, quiet Omega husband, a male Omega who had never shown a single sign of alpha lust, who had been nothing but perfectly compliant. Julian had known Enzo was watching him. He just hadn't known why. Moretti waved a hand, and Enzo stepped forward, his scent sharp with something that might have been anticipation. I'm going to ask you nicely one more time, Moretti said. Give me the codes, and you walk away. I don't have the codes, Julian said, and it was almost true. He had access, but it was through a web of passwords and biometrics that only he understood. Moretti's smile didn't waver. Then we'll have to find another way to motivate you. Enzo reached out and grabbed Julian's chin, forcing his head up, his grip bruising, his thumb pressing against the sensitive scent gland at Julian's jaw. I've waited a long time for this, he murmured, his voice low and thick with something Julian didn't want to name. To see you without your alpha's protection. To feel you without his scent on you. Julian felt his Omega instincts screaming at him to submit, to beg, to do anything to make the threat go away. But he had spent 5 years suppressing those instincts, controlling them, channeling them. So instead of crying or pleading, he smiled, a small sharp thing that made Enzo's grip loosen just a fraction. You'll never get what you want from me, he said softly. I don't need an alpha to protect me, and you're not going to touch me. Enzo's grip tightened, but Julian pressed on. Because you already showed your hand. And Dante knows. It was a bluff, or maybe it wasn't. Julian didn't know if Dante had figured out the betrayal yet, but he knew Enzo's arrogance, his need for control, his desperate desire to be seen as the clever one. If Julian could make him doubt, could plant a seed of fear. Enzo's eyes flickered, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. You're lying, he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Am I? Do you really think I came to this meeting without a safety net? I'm not stupid, Enzo. And I'm not weak. I'm Dante's Omega. You should know better than to underestimate me. The words hung in the air, charged and electric, and Enzo's grip on his chin loosened. Julian pressed his advantage. You have maybe a few hours before Dante's men find this place. Maybe less. And when they do, they're not going to be gentle. You should be worrying about how you're going to escape, not about what you're going to do to me. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Enzo let go, stepping back with his face contorted with rage, and Julian knew he'd won, for now. Moretti brought a laptop down to the basement, his patience clearly wearing thin. You have 1 hour, he said, sliding the device across the table toward Julian. Give me access to Rossini's main accounts, and you walk away. Julian knew it was a lie, that he was a loose and they would never let leave, but it was the chance he needed. He logged into the secure portal, his fingers moving with practiced speed, and Enzo and Moretti watched his every move. But they couldn't see the messages flying through the encrypted channels, couldn't see the data translating into code that only one person would understand. And then he saw it, a message from Dante, waiting in the system. He's with them. They have you. Find the money. Burn them to the ground. The words hit Julian like a physical blow. Dante knew. He'd figured it out, the betrayal, the kidnapping. And he was trusting Julian to handle it. Find the money. Burn them to the ground. Julian's hands trembled for just a moment, and then they steadied. He had a purpose now, a mission, and he began to type. The money wasn't in a bank or a vault or a safety deposit box. It was hidden in the source code of a defunct cryptocurrency platform that Dante's organization had used for a brief time a decade ago. A digital ghost, a treasure chest. Julian had found it months ago when he'd been going through Dante's financial records, and he'd recognized the pattern, the signature of the code. He'd traced it back to its origins, to the seed money that had been paid to the trader who sold out Dante's father, and that money had grown and multiplied and mutated, flowing through a dozen shell corporations and offshore accounts until it had become the foundation of the Moretti family's entire illegal empire. Julian found every dollar, and then he did something brilliant. He didn't steal the money. Stealing would be too simple, too clean. Instead, he executed a series of complex, layered transactions that linked the Moretti funds directly to known terrorist financing networks and international arms dealers, flagged the accounts, reported them, and set off every digital tripwire from the SEC to Interpol. He didn't just drain their coffers, he poisoned them. He attached Enzo's digital signature, captured from a dozen legitimate documents he'd signed over the years, to the most damning of the transactions. He was not just burning them down. He was framing them for a fire of their own making. When he was done, Julian pushed the laptop back. "It's done," he said, and Moretti grinned. "Good boy." He nodded to one of his men, and that was when the doors to the basement exploded inward. It wasn't a raid, it was just Dante. He moved through the dust and chaos not like a man, but like a force of nature, and he was not there to negotiate. He was there to end things. The violence was brutal, economical, and swift, and Dante was an alpha at the peak of his power, all raw strength and controlled rage. He dispatched Moretti's men with a speed that bordered on supernatural, his scent filling the room with the sharp, metallic tang of blood and fury. Julian didn't cower, didn't wait to be rescued. He grabbed the heaviest thing he could find, a rusted pipe fitting, and brought it down on the knee of the man reaching for him. The man screamed and went down, and Julian scrambled away, his eyes scanning for an exit. When the dust settled, only 3 people were left standing. Julian, breathing heavily with the pipe still in his hand. Dante, untouched with his suit immaculate despite the carnage. And Enzo, a dark hole in his shoulder, bleeding on the floor. Alessandro Moretti was dead at Dante's feet, and Dante walked over to Enzo with his face carved from ice. He didn't say a word, simply looked down at the man who had been his brother, his betrayal absolute. He raised his weapon, and Julian said, "No." His voice cut through the ringing silence, and Dante paused, his eyes finding Julian's. "Not like this," Julian said. "His way is with a bullet. Our way is better." He gestured to the laptop. "By tomorrow morning, every federal agency will be at his door. They'll take everything from him, his money, his name, his freedom. They'll bury him in a concrete cell for the rest of his life. Let them have him. Let him live with what he did." Dante looked from Julian to Enzo and back, and he saw the cold, clear logic in Julian's eyes, a vengeance more complete than any bullet could offer. He lowered his gun, walked over to Julian, and gently took the pipe from his hand, his fingers brushing against Julian's in an electric contact that made them both shiver. "You have ice in your veins, Julian Rossini," Dante said, his voice laced with a dark, unfamiliar admiration. "I learned from the best," Julian replied. They left Enzo for the authorities and walked out into the pre-dawn light of the city, and the world felt different, remade by the night's events. Julian was exhausted, trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear, but he held himself upright, refused to collapse in front of Dante. They didn't speak on the drive back to the penthouse, and the silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with everything that had just happened and everything that was about to. In the study, the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the room, and the signed divorce papers were still on the desk, a monument to the end of one era and the beginning of another. Dante picked them up, walked to the heavy crystal ashtray, and lit a corner of the document with his lighter. They both watched the paper curl and blacken, Julian's name and Dante's turning to ash. The divorce was a mistake, Dante said, and it was the closest he would ever come to an apology. It was a necessary transaction, Julian countered. It showed us both what we truly valued. Dante turned to him, and in his hand he held a heavy gold signet ring, the one he always wore on his right pinky, the one that had been his father's. He held it out to Julian, not placing it on his finger, but offering it in his open palm. The family needs a head, he said, his voice quiet but absolute. Not just a boss. It needs a mind. A partner. Julian looked at the ring, a crown and a cage, a promise of power and a life sentence. It was heavy with the blood of the past and the uncertainty of the future, and he thought of his quiet apartment, his books, the simple life he'd almost regained. He thought of the thrill of the fight, the cold satisfaction of watching an empire crumble at his command. He thought of the look in Dante's eyes when he'd realized who Julian truly was, and he knew that he had been a ghost in Dante's world, and now Dante was asking him to haunt it with him. What would I be? Julian asked. Your husband? Your partner? Your prisoner? None of those things, Dante said. All of them. Whatever you want to be. He stepped closer, his scent wrapping around Julian like a promise. I didn't see you before. I saw what I wanted to see. A pretty Omega who would never challenge me, who would never make me feel anything. I was wrong. You're the most terrifying person I've ever met. And I think I'm in love with you. Julian laughed, a sharp, surprised sound. You think? After all of this? I know. Dante's voice was steady. I've known for a while. I just didn't know how to say it. I didn't know how to be the kind of alpha who could deserve you. Julian looked at the ring in Dante's palm, and he made his decision. Then show me, he said. Show me you can be that alpha. Show me you can be my partner, not my keeper. Show me you can trust me. Dante's hand closed around the ring, and he reached for Julian's hand, sliding the ring onto Julian's finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been made for him. I can, Dante said. I will. He pulled Julian into his arms, and for a moment, Julian let himself be held, let himself feel the warmth of Dante's body, the steady beat of his heart, the rumble of his alpha's purr vibrating through his chest. Then he pulled back, just enough to look Dante in the eye. If you ever try to discard me again, I will destroy you. Dante smiled. A real smile, not the cold, controlled expression he wore in public. I don't doubt it. I'm serious. So am I. Dante's hand cupped Julian's cheek, his thumb tracing the line of his jaw. I'm not going to make that mistake again. You're not my wife, Julian. You're my match. My equal. My partner in everything. Julian leaned into his touch, feeling the tension drain from his body. Good. Because I'm not going anywhere. Dante kissed him, slow and deep, a claiming that was also a surrender, and Julian felt it in his bones, in his scent, in the suppressed Omega instincts that suddenly surged to life. He felt safe and powerful and loved, and he had been dismissed and underestimated and thrown away, and now he held the entire empire in his hands. I'm not your wife, Julian murmured against Dante's lips. I'm not your prisoner. I'm not your possession. I know. Dante's voice was rough with emotion. You're my partner. My equal. My everything. And if you ever forget that, I won't, Dante said. I can't. You made sure of that. Julian smiled, a small sharp thing that held all the power in the world. Good. Now finish your whiskey. We have work to do. Dante raised his glass in a toast. To my Omega. Julian raised his. To my Alpha. They drank, and the empire was theirs. 1 year later, the Rossini family had never been stronger. The Morettis were a memory, their assets seized, their leadership in prison, and the FBI had taken the credit for dismantling the organization, never knowing that the real architect of their victory was a small, quiet Omega who had once been dismissed as nothing more than a pretty face. Julian sat in Dante's study, now their study, staring at the financial reports spread across the mahogany desk, and he felt the familiar satisfaction of a job well done. The empire was his to manage, his to grow, his to protect, and he was good at it, better than Dante had ever been, better than anyone had ever expected. Dante walked in with a glass of whiskey in each hand, setting one down in front of Julian and pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "You're working too hard," he said, his voice warm with affection. "Someone has to keep this empire running," Julian replied. "You can't be trusted with the books." Dante laughed, a rich, genuine sound that still made Julian's stomach flutter after all these months. "Fair enough." He sat down in the chair across from Julian, watching him with a warmth that had taken months of careful negotiation and trust building to cultivate, and Julian felt the familiar surge of love and power and something that might have been triumph. "The board meeting went well," Dante said. "They're impressed with the new restructuring. They want to expand into the Asian markets." "Good." Julian made a note on his tablet. "I'll start looking into the regulations. We'll need to set up a subsidiary in Singapore." Dante leaned forward, his eyes glinting with amusement. "You know, when I married you, I thought you'd be content with planning dinner parties and charity galas. And now I'm terrified of you." Dante's smile softened. "And I'm the luckiest alpha in the world." Julian set down his tablet and reached across the desk, his fingers intertwining with Dante's. The signet ring glinted on his hand, his crown, his cage, his power, and he felt the familiar rush of satisfaction at how far he'd come. "Just remember," he said, "I'm not your wife. I'm your partner. You're equal. And if you ever forget that—" "I won't," Dante said. "I can't." "You made sure of that." Julian smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had finally found his place in the world, who had taken everything that had been given to him and made it his own. "Good," he said. "Now finish your whiskey. We have work to do." Dante raised his glass in a toast, his eyes never leaving Julian's face. "To my Omega." Julian raised his, feeling the weight of the ring on his finger, the weight of the empire in his hands, the weight of the alpha who had finally learned to see him. "To my alpha." They drank, and the empire was theirs, and Julian Ashford Rossini, the quiet Omega who had been dismissed and discarded and underestimated, was finally exactly where he belonged, at the center of everything, holding all the power and never, ever letting it go. The ring had been on Julian's finger for 18 months before Dante finally asked the question properly. It was a Tuesday, which seemed absurdly mundane for something that had been building for half a decade. Tuesday afternoons were for logistics, Julian reviewing quarterly reports while Dante took calls from his captains, the two of them orbiting each other in the penthouse like planets caught in the same gravity well. They'd long since stopped pretending that their arrangement was purely professional. The lines had blurred somewhere between the first time Dante had brought him coffee without being asked and the night Julian had fallen asleep on the study couch and woken to find Dante's jacket draped over him, the alpha's scent wrapped around him like a promise he hadn't been ready to accept. But Tuesday afternoons were still for logistics, and Julian was deep in spreadsheets when Dante appeared in the doorway of the study, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. The most feared alpha in New York, the man who had built an empire from blood and ambition and sheer force of will, was hovering like a nervous teenager. Julian looked up from his laptop, one eyebrow raised in silent question, and Dante cleared his throat. "We should talk," he said, which was never a good sign. Julian felt his stomach drop, the old familiar fear rising like a tide. He'd learned to trust Dante again, had slowly, painfully rebuilt something that might have been love, but the scars of being discarded once ran deep. About what? He kept his voice neutral, professional, the careful mask sliding back into place. Dante crossed the room in 3 long strides, and Julian saw that he was holding something small in his hand, a velvet box, dark blue, the kind of box that held things that changed lives. Julian's heart stuttered. "I bought you a ring once," Dante said, his voice rough with something that might have been embarrassment. "I put it on your finger in this room, in the aftermath of violence and chaos, and I told you it meant everything. And I meant it. But I never asked you properly. I never gave you a choice. Julian's throat tightened. Dante, I'm asking now. Dante dropped to one knee in front of him. This formidable, terrifying alpha who had never knelt for anyone, who had built his entire identity on never bending, never breaking, never showing weakness. He was kneeling on the Persian rug in front of his quiet Omega, and there was nothing weak about it. There was everything strong about it. Julian Ashford Rossini, you walked into my life 5 years ago, and I was too stupid to see what I had. I saw a pretty face and a compliant Omega, and I didn't look deeper because I was afraid of what I might find. I was afraid of needing someone. I was afraid of trusting anyone. And you, his voice cracked, just slightly, and Julian felt his eyes sting. You changed everything. You made me see. You made me want to be the kind of alpha who could deserve you. Julian reached out, his fingers brushing Dante's jaw, feeling the stubble that had grown in since that morning. You don't have to kneel, he whispered. I know. I want to. Dante opened the box, and the ring inside was breathtaking. Not the heavy gold signet ring that still sat on Julian's right hand, but a delicate platinum band set with a small, perfect diamond. It was understated and elegant and completely Julian. I'm asking you to marry me. For real this time. Not because I need a convenient Omega, not because I want a partner in the business, but because I love you. Because I can't imagine my life without you. Because you've made me into someone I didn't know I could be. Julian looked at the ring, and he thought about everything they'd been through. The divorce, the betrayal, the kidnapping, the bloody night in that basement. He thought about the years of being invisible, being furniture, being nothing. He thought about the moment he'd signed those divorce papers, the cold certainty that he would never be loved the way he deserved. And he thought about the man kneeling in front of him now, the man who had learned to see, to trust, to love. Yes, he said, and his voice was steady despite the tears spilling down his cheeks. Yes, of course yes. Dante slid the ring onto his finger, and Julian felt the weight of it. Not heavy like the signet ring, not a crown and a cage, but something lighter and more precious. A promise, a choice, a love that had been hard-won and fiercely protected. Dante surged up to kiss him, and Julian felt the alpha's hands cup his face with an almost reverent tenderness, and he thought, this is what I was waiting for. This is what I survived for. But Dante being Dante, he couldn't let the moment pass without some kind of complication. I should probably mention, he murmured against Julian's lips, that I've already started planning the wedding. Julian laughed, a shocked, delighted sound. You've been planning this for a while, haven't you? Since the night you hit that man with a pipe. Dante grinned, and it was a terrible, wonderful grin, the grin of a man who had been thoroughly and completely conquered. I knew then that you were the only one for me. Flatterer. Truth teller. Julian kissed him again, and in the background, the quarterly reports glowed on his laptop screen, and the empire continued to spin, and somewhere out in the city, the Moretti's assets were being seized and Enzo was rotting in a federal prison, and none of it mattered. All that mattered was the alpha kneeling in front of him, finally brave enough to ask, and the Omega who was finally brave enough to say yes. The wedding was not the elaborate affair that the Rossini name might have demanded. Julian insisted on something small, intimate, meaningful. Just the people who actually mattered, not the hundreds of sycophants and business associates and distant cousins who would have attended out of obligation rather than love. It took 3 weeks of negotiation to convince Dante, who was used to doing everything on a grand scale, but Julian was relentless. If we have a big wedding, I will spend the entire day managing everyone else's expectations, Julian said flatly. I will be exhausted and stressed, and I will not enjoy a single moment of it. Is that what you want? Dante, who had learned the hard way that arguing with Julian was about as effective as arguing with a freight train, surrendered gracefully. Small wedding, he agreed. Intimate. Meaningful. But I'm renting the venue. Which venue? The Central Park Boathouse. Julian blinked. That's not small. It is by Rossini standards. Dante's smile was pure mischief. Trust me, I've already scaled it back. I was planning to book the entire Met. You were not. I absolutely was. You're very persuasive. Julian laughed, and they settled on the boathouse. Elegant, but not ostentatious. Beautiful, but not overwhelming. The guest list was pared down to 30. Dante's 2 surviving uncles, Julian's grandmother who still refused to believe he'd married into a criminal family, a handful of close associates who had proven themselves loyal, and Leo, the head of security who had found Julian's shoe and set the rescue in motion. Julian also insisted on inviting Lydia, Enzo's widow. Dante had been stunned by the request. She's Enzo's wife. She's Enzo's widow, Julian corrected. She didn't betray you. She betrayed him. She called me to warn me about the Morettis. She was on our side. Dante had been silent for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly. You're right. I'm sorry. I see her, and I remember him. I know. Julian had reached out to take his hand. That's why we should invite her. So she knows she's not defined by his choices. So she knows she has a place with us. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, unseasonably warm for October, and Julian woke in their penthouse with Dante's arms wrapped around him and a sense of peace he'd never thought he'd feel. He dressed in a simple cream suit, elegant, understated, nothing like the designer confections he'd worn for the first marriage. He had flowers in his hair, tiny white blossoms that his grandmother had arranged herself, and when he looked in the mirror, he saw someone he barely recognized. Not the quiet, terrified Omega who'd signed those divorce papers. Not the ghost who'd haunted the edges of Dante's world. Someone new. Someone whole. Dante was waiting at the altar, his dark eyes shining with a warmth that still made Julian's heart skip. He was wearing a charcoal suit, impeccably tailored, and he looked so beautiful that Julian almost forgot to breathe. They'd written their own vows, short and fierce and deeply personal, and Julian had made Dante promise not to cry. I'm going to cry, Dante had said flatly. It's going to happen. Just deal with it. I will kill you if you ruin my makeup. Alpha instincts. Can't be helped. Julian had laughed, and now, standing at the altar with the sunlight streaming through the windows, he understood. Dante was crying. Not loud sobs, but silent tears that tracked down his cheeks as he looked at Julian. You're so beautiful, he whispered, and Julian felt his own eyes sting. You're ridiculous, he whispered back. But he was also crying, and Dante was laughing through his tears, and the officiant was clearing his throat and trying to get them back on track. The vows were simple. Promises to see each other, to trust each other, to build something together that would outlast everything they'd survived. Julian promised to be the partner Dante had never known he needed. Dante promised to be the alpha who would never underestimate his omega again. They exchanged rings, the delicate platinum band sliding onto Julian's finger beside the gold signet ring, and a matching band for Dante, plain and elegant and utterly new. When the officiant pronounced them wed, Dante kissed him with the kind of passion that made their guests cheer and the photographer blush, and Julian felt the familiar rush of power and love and triumph. He was no longer the discarded omega, the piece of furniture, the quiet wife who had been dismissed. He was Julian Ashford Rossini, and he was exactly where he belonged. The reception was held on the boathouse's terrace, the sky beginning to blush with the colors of sunset, and Julian circulated among his guests with the easy grace that had once been a mask and was now genuine. His grandmother pulled him aside to tell him she still didn't approve of the family business, but she approved of Dante's smile, which she'd apparently been told was the key to all good marriages. Dante's uncles got progressively drunker and more emotional, recounting stories of Dante's childhood that had the alpha turning a shade of red Julian had never seen on him before. And Lydia, Enzo's widow, arrived late, her eyes red-rimmed but her head high. She approached Julian with a gift wrapped in silver paper, and her hands trembled as she handed it to him. I didn't know if I should come, she admitted. I didn't know if you'd want me here. Julian took her hands in his, squeezing them gently. You called me. You warned me. You saved my life, Lydia. You always have a place with us. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, and Julian hugged her, feeling her shake against him. I had no idea about Enzo, she said. I had no idea what he was doing. I swear to you, I had no idea. I know, Julian said. I believe you. The gift was a set of antique teacups, beautiful, delicate porcelain that had belonged to Lydia's grandmother. For your tea rituals, Lydia explained, wiping her eyes. I know you like to have tea in the morning. I thought. It's perfect, Julian said, and he meant it. Dante came up behind him, his hands settling on the small of Julian's back in that possessive way that Julian had grown to love. He nodded to Lydia, a short, sharp acknowledgement that held no animosity. Thank you for coming, he said. And thank you for saving him. Lydia looked stunned, and Julian felt a surge of pride in his alpha. He was learning. He was trying. That was all Julian had ever asked. Their first dance was to something slow and old, a song that had been playing in the background the night they'd first met. Julian leaned his head against Dante's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and let himself drift. I used to think I'd never get this, he murmured. I used to think I'd spend the rest of my life being invisible. Dante's arms tightened around him. I'm sorry I made you feel that way. I'm sorry it took me so long to see. You see now? I see everything. Dante pulled back just enough to look at him, his dark eyes filled with a reverence that made Julian's breath catch. I see you, Julian. I see your strength and your power and your terrifying brilliance. I see the way you take my empire apart and put it back together better. I see the way you make me want to be better. Julian smiled, slow and satisfied. That's exactly what I wanted you to see. Dante laughed, pulling him close again. You're impossible. You love it. I love everything about you. Julian kissed him, soft and sweet, and the world fell away. The music, the guests, the city beyond, none of it mattered. All that mattered was this. Two broken people who had found a way to be whole together, who had burned down everything that had kept them apart and built something stronger in its place. Later, when the guests had gone and the champagne had been drunk and the penthouse was quiet, Julian curled up against Dante's side and felt the weight of the rings on his finger. The signet ring, heavy and ancient and full of history. The platinum band, light and new and full of promise. Two symbols of two different kinds of power, and both of them his. Thank you for giving me a choice, he said softly. This time, Dante pressed a kiss to the top of his head. You deserved one. You deserved everything. I'm sorry I took so long to figure that out. Better late than never. Was it worth it? The waiting. Julian thought about everything they'd been through. The divorce, the betrayal, the kidnapping, the bloody basement. He thought about the years of silence and the moments of terror and the slow, painful rebuilding of trust. He thought about the way Dante had knelt in front of him on a Tuesday afternoon and asked the question he should have asked years ago. Every second of it, he said. Every single second. Dante pulled him closer, and Julian felt the alpha's purr start low in his chest, vibrating through Julian's body like a comfort. I love you, Dante said. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know that. I know it already. Then I'll spend the rest of my life reminding you. Julian smiled against Dante's chest, feeling the warmth and the safety and the overwhelming love. He had been invisible once, a piece of furniture in a gilded cage, a quiet omega who had been dismissed and discarded. Now he was the queen of an empire, the partner of the most powerful alpha in New York, and the architect of his own fate. He had signed his name on that divorce paper, and it had been the beginning of everything. He had burned it down, and from the ashes, he had built something new. And this time, he was never letting go.